This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host.
Welcome everyone. This is the Meaningful Sport podcast, and I am your host, Noora Ronkainen. Meaningful Sport is a series of discussions on the why and how involvement in sport and physical activity can be an important part of a life worth living. We will also explore threats to meaningful engagement in sport and movement culture practices and ask questions about what we can learn about the human condition through our involvement in sport. The guests are leading scholars in human and social sciences of sport who share their explorations in a scholarly as well as a personal context. If you are interested in the theme, you might also want to check out meaningfulsport.com. There you can find podcast show notes, read a blog, and access many resources for further explorations of meaningful sport. In the previous episodes, we have mostly focused on how and why sport is meaningful for athletes, but they are by no means the only actors involved in sport who can derive meaning from their participation. Playing sport as an athlete can be one important dimension of living a meaningful life, but so could be other types of involvement in sport, such as being a coach. And how the coach is in the sport world has important implications for the experience of the athlete and whether and how the athlete can experience meaningful participation. Our guest today has explored what it means to be a coach and has recently focused on understanding how coaches can develop caring relationships with athletes. In his work, he often uses a phenomenological and narrative research approach and some of the less conventional qualitative methods, such as diary writing. He's a senior lecturer in sport coaching and physical education at Liverpool John Moores University and serves as an associate editor for the journal Sports Coaching Review. So welcome, Colum Cronin, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello, Noora. It's great to be here. I've really enjoyed listening to some of the other podcasts, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, me too, and thanks so much. And I think to start out our discussion today, it's always quite enjoyable to hear kind of who is behind the research and how your personal experiences in sport and being a sports coach as well can influence how you approach your work and how these personal experiences influence the types of questions you are asking. So maybe talk a little bit about your own sporting background and your own coaching background as well.
Okay. So yeah, I'd probably describe myself as an average at best athlete. My sport was basketball. I was encouraged to play by my older sister, and my first coach was actually a female English teacher at our high school who set up the basketball team and got us playing there. And that seemed like a really good idea when I was about 11. Because I think I was quite tall at that stage. I was about maybe 5'7" as an 11-year-old. The problem is I was also 5'7" as a 13-year-old. Eventually stretching just a little bit beyond that. And by the time I was 18, I was still a similar height, and I hadn't progressed much as an athlete. And I knew that I wasn't going to make it as a basketball player. So I looked to do a sport management degree. I looked to get as close to basketball as I could. And that was at the University of Northumbria in Newcastle in England. And from there, I met the local basketball development officer, a lady called Deirdre Hayes, and she got me volunteering coaching. And coaching was basically as close as I could get to playing. So it was really exciting for me, working with young people, working with adults, playing games, preparing teams. So I very much fell in love with coaching. Later on, basketball in England is quite underdeveloped as a sport. So at best, there's a semi-professional setup So there's a big amateur game. So I also needed to find a career. So I fell into kind of PE teaching and teaching at a college. And basically, as I went through PE teaching and teaching sport, I started to almost have a bit of an identity question, a burning question, which was, am I a teacher or am I a coach? Because I saw lots of similarities. During the day, I would teach, I would plan lessons, I would work with young people, I'd reflect on those lessons. In the evening, I would plan basketball sessions, deliver them, reflect on those sessions. So I was seeing lots of similarities. And I had this burning question, and that actually became the question for my PhD, really, which was, what does it mean to be a coach versus maybe what does it mean to be a teacher? And for that, I was supervised by Professor Kathy Armour, another female influence on my life, a very positive one. And to answer that question, what does it mean to be a coach? What is coaching as opposed to what is teaching? I ended up turning to phenomenology. So that's a whistle-stop tour. I don't know if you want to explore any of that a bit further, or does that give you a clear picture?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice introduction, and we should probably discuss a bit further what the difference, what it means to be a teacher versus what it means to be a coach. But I think you already started kind of mentioning the phenomenological approach and the phenomenological research philosophy. And we had some discussions on phenomenology in this podcast already, and there are different strands of phenomenology. I guess nobody knows all of them very well, or I don't know how you can do that given there are so many different types of phenomenology. And Gunnar Breivik, for example, discussed Heidegger's philosophy and how he's using that in a more sports philosophy context. But it would be quite interesting to hear just kind of why phenomenology was inspirational for you, and what would be some of the key thinkers and texts that were important for you in developing your own approach to phenomenology.
Yeah, that's a nice place to start, really. I suppose there was a key paper which was done by Kerry and Armour, and Kathy Armour was my PhD supervisor. So she had flagged that to me, but it was maybe 2000 was that paper, and I think it was called The Promise of Phenomenology for Sport. So it was a nice starting paper which kind of outlined that there might be some value in phenomenology for sport research. And one of the key arguments in that paper was kind of almost the embodied and sensual nature of sport. So, we come to sport through our senses. We hear the sound of a basketball. You can almost tell the intensity of a basketball game by the squeak of the shoes on the court, and by the volume of the players when they're talking and defending, as well as the sweat, as well as the straining, the pain. The feel of a basketball court is almost the smell of certain sport venues, the change room. So sport's a very sensual experience, and that maybe phenomenology can help us to capture those sensory experiences, to understand and look through them, and shine a light on sport experiences. And I think that's kind of the main argument in that paper. And I think that's why Kathy probably flagged it for me. But there's probably another reason why I thought it might be valuable to coaching. Because again, coaching can be quite embodied. Your heart race is pounding, you're listening to players, you're caught up in the moment. But also we know a lot of coaches learn through experience. We know a lot of coaches learn through interaction with each other, communities of practice, informal reflective conversations. So therefore we kind of know that coaching is this embodied process, which, you kind of learn in a given world. And I think from the coaching research, and then coupled with the Kerry and Armour paper, that made me think that actually understanding the experience of coaches and the world that they inhabit is the route through to understanding what it means to be a coach and what is coaching. What do you think, Nora?
I think all of that makes a lot of sense to me. And just reading your paper on being a coach, I just really love the approach that often a lot of coaching research is that what do the coaches do, and going into kind of details of the coaching practice and what works and what doesn't work, and how can we change that and so forth. But kind of your starting point, the existential question of what does it mean to be a coach, I think that's we should start from the fundamentals, and so I really love that paper.
I'm smiling here now, Nora. You can't see, but I'm smiling because I'm glad you appreciate the paper. It's probably my favorite paper that I've written, and I think one of the reasons why I like it is that it's that idea that maybe the coach has knowledge and understanding that us as researchers don't have, and that maybe the starting point to understand what is coaching is to ask the people who are doing it, not necessarily to go along and observe them from a distance, or but to maybe appreciate and value their experience. That doesn't mean we don't necessarily critically consider their experiences, but it means that we value that actually they're in the world. They probably know it better than us. So let's start by asking them to describe that experience. And that's probably a theme across most of my research then, is value in the practitioner experience, doing research with them rather than doing research on them. And that again links us to phenomenology, which is, the key tenet is the route to understanding is experience. If we want to experience what it means, to know what it means to be a coach, we need to experience it, or at least speak to somebody who does experience it.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about the background of the Being in the Coaching World paper, about the idea and also about the research process, how you did that.
Yeah. So if I take you back to my coaching experiences then, so I was a basketball coach, and I was, as I said, teaching most of the time. I was also doing research, my PGC and master's degree. So I was quite busy, and I was coaching at kind of a reasonable standard, but not necessarily a high performance setting. I was kind of on the fringes of that. So I would coach county teams, but not the national team. I would coach, some underage players who might go for national team trials, but I wouldn't necessarily be coaching a group of 12 of them. So I was kind of on the periphery of that high performance world. And that was the world I was looking to go into. And that then leads to the question, what does it mean to be kind of a youth performance coach and a national team coach, producing athletes who are going to international competitions. And that world is sometimes closed off. You need capital to enter that world. If you haven't got necessarily a professional background as an athlete, it can be difficult to enter that world. So again, I wanted to understand that world. So the route to understanding from a phenomenological perspective is experience. So hence I need to go and speak to the people who experience that world. So I spent some time with international coaches, a basketball coach, but I also wanted to get a variety of experiences. So we also looked at athletics coaches. We also looked at male coaches, female coaches, team sport, individual. But all these coaches had experience of international youth coaching. And that was the world I was trying to understand. And to spend time with them then, it was just a kind of series of interviews over a 3-year period. Because I wanted to understand what it means to be a coach in pre-season, what it means to be a coach at the end of a season, during a season. So there's a temporality around experience there. Our experience is different at different times. So I needed to understand that really. So 3 years, interviews, and asking them in those interviews very descriptive questions. Can you tell me where you coach? Can you tell me when you coach? Who was there when you are a coach? And really almost playing the fool, asking the innocent question to get them to describe. And these coaches were very patient with me, and they gave me kind of interviews would last kind of an hour to two. They almost found it cathartic, the interviews. They were able to describe and think about their practice. It was an hour or two out of a busy schedule. And in doing that, I kind of came to some insights around their life world. I came to some insights around what is at the essence, at the core of coaching. I applied kind of phenomenological methods. So there's a couple of phenomenological techniques. One is called horizontalism, where you look across data to find what is a common core. One is called imaginative variation, where you look at that core and you consider, would this activity be the same if this wasn't here? Is it really essential to this activity? Can this experience take place without this element? Or is this element essential to it? Is it an essence? How might this element manifest itself in different times, in different places, with different people, while still remaining an essence? So these are the phenomenological data analysis methods that I used, which I don't think I've seen too often in coaching research or sport research. So, people might find value in looking at them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's in the data analysis section, really. And through that 3-year process, through looking through their subjective experiences, through torturing that data, through those horizontalism and imaginative variation, identifying kind of 3 core essence of what it means to be a coach, but also describing the life world, the world of where these people coach, the world that I was struggling to get into as a young developing coach. So that's where I got to. I'd be interested in your thoughts, Nora. Yeah, on any of that.
Yeah. Let's go through the essences, and I think then we can reflect on that together. So maybe you share the essences that you identified first.
Yeah. So there's 3 essences, and as I said, the life world of where these essences manifest is quite important. So maybe if I start with the life world to provide a bit of context, what I found about these coaches was that their life world extended beyond the field of play. Most of the coaching research I was reading at the time was about on court, on pitch, in a gym. And that's useful research, and that's part of being a coach. But when I asked these coaches where were they coaches and when were they coached, they often described phone calls in coffee shops or meetings in coffee shops, planning sessions at home at their kitchen table. One coach described reading athletes' training diaries on a Sunday night in her living room. So the life world of the coach extends beyond the field of play. They were also a coach on buses where they would have conversations with athletes. They were also a coach in hotel rooms. These guys would go to warm weather training, and they would coach athletes on the plane, on the bus, in transport. And I thought that was really helpful because it extends where we need to research coaching. It says, okay, we have a lot of research about how coaches can behave on the field of play, but what about in all these other areas? Then when I drilled down into what were they doing across all these areas, I got to 3 essences. First and foremost, I found that these coaches were caring, and that's a really loaded term. So I don't know if you want to come in or if you want me to continue and explain and elaborate that.
Yeah. Let's talk about all 3 of them. You can explain them first, and then we can reflect a little bit together.
So my understanding of care at this stage was kind of almost 2 forms. There was care in terms of what Heidegger might term like a concern, an interest. So these coaches were concerned for their sport. They were concerned for their fellow staff. They were concerned for their activity. So they would often do coach development workshops. They would often help out and mentor younger coaches. They They would try to raise the quality, status of their sport. They would do a lot of admin work around there. So they were concerned about their sport and, and interested in that. And, I think probably all coaches are. Otherwise, why would you go out on a Tuesday night in the rain and the cold to coach, That's a slightly different form of care than caring for someone. You can be concerned for your coach, but not very caring for athletes. Now, fortunately for me, the 4 coaches that I interviewed also described caring for athletes. So they described, coffee shop conversations where they would mentor athletes, listen to their concerns. One coach described, he was coaching young athletes. They might have problems in schools. Parents would often come to him and they would work through these problems with the athletes. He would have dinner with the parents, almost in a mentor capacity, dinner with the athletes, so mentor them so that try to develop them as individuals, not just as athletes, as role models, life skills. So they were caring for athletes as well as caring about their sport. So there was concern for other things. So that was the first thing I saw. And again, if we only look at what happens on the field of play, we might miss all of that. So that's why understanding life world is important. The second thing, though, is that isn't just enough. They were also committed to educating the athletes for the challenges of their sport. Sport is, physically and mentally demanding. So on the field of play and off the field of play, through these caring relationships, they would educate. And that could manifest itself differently, as I said, at different times. One coach talked about how, he adopts the role of a teacher when athletes are 12. Maybe he becomes a bit more of a facilitator once they become 14, 15, 16, a bit more of a mentor. And eventually the coach talked about how as the athletes go into adulthood, they actually end up teaching him because they know what it means to, perform at a high level, and how their body feels. So how that education occurs can be very different in different contexts and at different times, but all the coaches involved were committed to educating their athletes for the challenges to come. A good example was, a sprint coach talking about in international competition, athletes have to warm up on their own, 45 minutes. It can be a lonely place. They're surrounded by their competitors. It can be intimidating. So he has to educate athletes for that challenge to cope without him. That probably shows where I was struggling to see the difference between coaching and teaching, because both of them are educative acts, and that's what they've got in common there, So that's kind of the second essence. First is care about and for, and then through those caring for relationships, a commitment to educating them. And then the third element was really this idea of working with others to achieve a corporal excellence. I use the term corporal to kind of avoid a mind-body dualism here. But I think working with others was really key, because one of the things I noticed about these coaches is being part of a youth performance coach meant involve interacting with referees, interacting with parents, with agents, with support staff such as physios. And again, we kind of miss a lot of that in our coaching research when we just focus on the coach-athlete interaction on the field of play. A good example of that is maybe when we look at how opposing coaches work and interact together. Often we see, high-profile coaches in a media narrative which pits one coach against the other as competing. But actually, in some ways, these coaches are actually collaborating, because excellence is defined by your performance in relation to somebody else. So you need an opposing coach to raise your standards, to challenge you, to pose problems for athletes to solve. So we should be looking at coach-coach relationships not as competitive, aggressive confrontational, but actually collaborative. I can't coach a basketball team unless I have an opposition to play against. I need that opposing coach. And the better quality that opposing coach is, the better quality my basketball team can develop, because we can play against them and learn, reflect, and share ideas. And so working with others, such as referees, such as opponents, such as management, is a key part of being a coach, and it's a key part of defining what is excellence. Ultimately, we live in an interpersonal world. Again, if we go to Heidegger would say we're thrown into this world. Well, opposing coaches and referees and management exist. I have to interact with them. And again, if we only look at what happens between a coach and athlete on the field of play, we miss that interaction, that wider interpersonal element of coaching. They're my three essences, and any one of them could be unpicked and probably become a podcast in its own right. I don't know how you want to proceed. Is there something that's unclear or interesting to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I have like two questions at the moment. The first one would be about self-care with coaches. We know that a lot of them easily are sacrificing some aspects of their personal life because they are too immersed in coaching in a sense. So whether and how coaches learn to self-care. And I guess the other part is kind of thinking about the coaching life project in terms of the coach herself or himself, in terms of, as a coach, you are developing your own excellence and you have a sense of becoming in the coaching. So you are definitely oriented towards your athletes and caring for your athletes, but at the same time you are probably caring or concerned about your own development. So kind of this, for example, in volunteering literature, it said that yes, it is other-oriented activity, but there is also this kind of self-oriented activity and that personal development aspect. So maybe those two things would be interesting to explore further.
Yeah, absolutely. And sat here this morning reflecting back on the paper and the data. I'm not sure. I don't necessarily see a dichotomy. It's not that I can only care about athletes, but I don't then care about my own development, or I don't have a concern for my sport. I mean, we all have multiple people that we care for in our lives, whether that's family, work colleagues, partners, So it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other. On the self-care question, I think it's really pertinent. What we did was, following up on this project, we wrote a book with my PhD supervisor, Kathy Armour, Care in Sports Coaching, and each coach became a kind of case study chapter in its own right. But what was interesting was, across one of those chapters focuses on self-care. And the reason it does that was because it was an issue brought up by all of the coaches. Coaches talked about the strain of, travel, the strain of being a coach at home as well as on the field of play, investing so much emotional labor into their athletes that they might not invest so much into their other relationships, whether that's partners or family. And some of them talked about, regretting not spending time with elderly parents, regretting not spending more time with partners, breakdown in relationships with partners. So, it was a common feature. And I think it then takes us into burnout. It takes us into, self-care. And I don't necessarily have all the answers on that. What I would say though is that, possibly some of the answers are kind of organizational. What can organizations do to help? What climates can we create to help? Some of them are maybe personal, and that kind of ties into the second one. That, having said all of that, all of the coaches really identified strongly with being a coach. One of these coaches was very experienced. He was in his 70s, and I asked him about retirement, and he basically said, I am a coach. I will be a coach for life. He talked about taking on athletes and what I thought was amazing really was he was talking about taking on athletes not just for the season, but for their career. So you're making a 10, 15, 20-year commitment to those athletes to be a mentor, to be a coach, to support them. So that was the level of commitment and identity. You know, he was 70 years old. You know, I would meet him in Starbucks and he would turn up in a tracksuit. That was his identity. That was him. He was a coach. And all four of them were like that. And again, that probably reflects my identity crisis that prompted the whole study. Was I a teacher? Was I a coach? And I also wondered, and I know you've done some work around meaningfulness, I wondered if there's a project on meaningful coaching. I'd be interested in your thoughts. Can I ask you to answer that question?
Yeah, of course you can ask. Yeah, so as far as what I've seen, there isn't a meaningful coaching project. So I haven't come across that, and if that exists, then I would really love to hear. So if somebody's doing that, please get in touch. But I think that would be something that would really be interesting. And my postdoc when I was at John Moores University, part of that was looking at coaches' careers and the meaning they find in coaching. And so I guess just kind of linking to what you are saying about caring for the athlete and caring for the sport as well, not just about the specific athlete, but you are actually concerned about the whole sport and the future of your sport, and you want to contribute. I think that really links to meaningful work literature, which kind of emphasizes that people want to do things that kind of transcend their self-interest. So meaningful work is typically something that you can see that it makes the world a bit better place in some ways. And so I think that's something that connects to coaching right away. At the same time, usually people also want to be doing work that kind of helps them in their personal growth, that they feel that they are developing and they are learning new things. And definitely in coaching, that's kind of everyday problem solving. How can I help my athlete to become better? How can we kind of get over this injury? So I think just looking at the work in the literature, meaningful work, I think it would make like perfect sense to use that to explore questions about coaching and meaningful coaching.
Yeah, I think that is, is perfect really. Looking back, the coaches, there was almost a sense of legacy, building a program or maintaining standards in a sport, leaving a sport in a better situation after their impact.
Exactly the same things that the coaches, especially the older coaches, were telling me. So I guess some of the younger coaches were more concerned about their using coaching as some work experience to help get a job later on. But especially the little bit more mature and more experienced and older coaches were kind of really concerned about their sport as it is and what's the future of their sport and how can they help to make it a better future for their sport.
Absolutely. And then on top of that, you have the interpersonal relationships, committing to an athlete even after they've stopped coaching them for a particular season, but still being their coach and their mentor that they can pick up a phone call to, still checking in on the athlete, still having communication, even if the athlete moves on to a different club, a different team, but having that relationship again. They were citing meaningful work there, I think. So, yeah. So basically there's some work here for you, Nora, to progress.
Probably for both of us.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to delegate it.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in this show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcast or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.